Hello, I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. Welcome to Check This Out at the Hanover Library, the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire. I'm so excited tonight. My guest is the second in our series of Check This Out, Kelly J. Ford. I'm thrilled to have her here. In this exciting new series, we are introducing you to authors and books that we think you should be reading and talking about. Thank you so much to the Howe Library Corporation for sponsoring this amazing series. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you. It's really exciting to be here.
I'm so excited to have you. I absolutely love this book, Real Bad Things. If you guys haven't read it yet, go out, buy a copy, read it, or check it out at your library. So it's a good one, right? You gotta laugh. It's the best name ever. All right, before we get started, for those of you that don't know Kelly, I'm just going to read a quick bio, and then we're going to jump right in.
Perfect.
All right, here we go. Kelly J. Ford is the author of the award-winning Cottonmouth, also an amazing novel, a novel of impressive depths of character and setting, according to the LA Review, which named it one of their best books of 2017. Whew! An Arkansas native, Kelly writes about power and pitfalls of friendship, the danger of long-held secrets, and the transcendent grittiness of the Ozarks and their surrounds. She lives in Vermont with her wife and cat. And I'm so excited to have you here tonight. Thank you, Kelly. So tell us, what is this amazing book, Real Bad Things, about?
Real Bad Things, it's my second novel, as Rachel mentioned. It is about a woman who returns home 25 years after confessing to her stepfather's murder. She was never convicted because there was no body, no crime for those Taylor Swift fans out there. And
that would be me.
And me, super Swifties.
Okay.
Perfect. And so once a body does turn up after a historic flood in the Arkansas River, Jane Mooney returns home to pay the consequences, but other secrets come to light with that flood as well.
So this is truly gritty. There's crime, there's love, there's sex, there's death, right? There's mystery, all the good things you can find in a book. And I absolutely loved it. But the craziest thing is the book opens and this woman had confessed, right? Jane had confessed to a murder that there was no body, but she confessed, right? I want to make sure you got this, like no body, but she confessed. So one of my favorite paragraphs in the book, actually, you write, I'm having a hard time figuring out why you'd confess to a murder during a routine questioning at your home when the cops didn't even have a case. It's almost like you were making sure someone else didn't say it first.
Oh my.
Dun, dun, dun. So you're setting up a secret. Can you talk about why did you land on this idea that you were going to write a book about a murder without a body, right? And then the body that surfaces 25 years later.
Absolutely. I grew up in Arkansas. Maud Bottoms is based on actually the Bottoms, which is a real place out by Lock and Dam 13. And so it's the Arkansas River is right there. And so I'm always fascinated by this idea of, not fascinated, that sounds terrible, but of drowning. I know it sounds terrible. So I've always had that in my mind. And I've always, I'm drawn to themes about missing people and what happens to the people left behind. And so I really wanted to also think about, I love whodunits, but I don't necessarily like writing whodunits. I prefer to read and write about why something happened and kind of, you see someone and you figure out that, what happened to you? And then you kind of tunnel back and go back to the beginning, kind of like, what happened here? Yeah. So it's really fun for me. And I was a psychology major, so I'm just like super into the psychological aspects of characters.
Yes, there's a lot of psychology in this book, I would say. In particular, this idea that Jane had a rough childhood, right? And we read about, sort of how she got to that moment, how there came to be a body. And there were a lot of hard things. She grew up, with a lot of domestic abuse in her life, right? A lot of violence. She was hungry. There wasn't a lot of money, right? There was sort of a lot of very hard, heavy subjects that come into play behind this, the disappearance of her stepdad, right. Warren, right? And so there's a lot of mystery, and all of a sudden she's confessing, and no one is really surprised. Right. So can you talk about, the fact that she's confessing and no one's surprised and there's still no body? Why is the whole town behind this idea, right? Believing that she did it.
Well, I think it's one of those things. I mean, if you watch enough true crime docuseries, which I do, especially HBO, I love those. There's always this idea of a confession being kind of the be all end all. And the idea of false confessions is fascinating to me because they know that someone has gone missing. They know that something's wrong, but they don't have a body. So naturally they can't hold her, but that stigma stays with her because again, why would you confess to something? There's something else going on. And I think in a lot of small towns and even, neighborhoods in bigger cities, there's this chatter that people love. And it's kind of like, oh, that's the person who confessed to murdering her stepfather, but they never found the body. So it's that gossip item in there. And so that's why I included things like the excerpts from Let's Talk About Maude, the two local body shop workers who are on the case and are always talking about what's going on in town and kind of feeding the fire.
Yes, so we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Yeah, but first I want to stick with the body, right?
And
so we've got Jane. She hated her stepfather, and he goes missing. She goes out. She lives her life for 25 years outside, right, of Maude Bottoms, and then she comes back. And she is expected to pay for his funeral, right? So you write this amazing scene where she's like shopping for coffins for this man that she hated, right? Who terrorized her. Mm-hmm. I mean, that was a brilliant scene. Can you talk about how that came together in your head?
Yeah. So Jane goes back to town because of her mother. And so there is a complicated familial relationship there. They obviously do not get along. But Jane and her brother Jason basically grew up with neglect, and she still has a hole in her heart from, the love she hasn't gotten from her mother. And so in many ways, whether she wants to or not, she's always trying to perform and get that love from her mother, even if it's really twisted, such as by paying for the coffin of the person you confessed to murdering.
It's so twisted, and yet we're laughing because there's something almost humorous about the fact that it can be that terrible, right? It's like you sort of treat these really heavy topics with humor, and I think they open up a way for us to talk about it. And one of my favorite, of course, is the town calls Jane Leslie Borden. Right? How did you come to that name? It's brilliant.
It just felt right. Not growing up, but spending much of my adult life in Boston, you hear about Lizzie. I can't even remember how to say it correctly. Lizzie Borden in Rhode Island, and just knowing about that. And I just thought, with these small towns and with these kind of crimes, people always have a nickname for them. So it was just funny to me. Yeah. And I know some people are like, oh, but
it's hilarious.
I think humor is a way that so many people cope with trauma and strange events that happen.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the secrets that comes out through the book, of course, right, is Jane has had a love affair growing up, or sort of love interest, I guess, and it's this other woman, Georgia Lee, who is in the closet. She's queer, but she's not ready to talk about it. And 25 years later, she's still not ready to talk about it, right? She's ashamed. But this is one of those secrets. Can you talk about how that was buried into the story too?
I think so. They began as kind of first loves for one another, true first loves, even if they had, been with other people, the person they really connected with. But because of this event that happened and her stepfather going missing, it kind of cleaved their lives. And so there was really no way to go back. So I saw them as kind of interrupted, and their own story never got to have any closure. And so I think when you've got that kind of abrupt non-ending, it just sticks with you. And I wanted to explore what that would be like for someone who just one day you're having a normal day, and the very next it's the worst day of your life, and you can't really even see the person that means the most to you and explore what all that means with them, because you're just not allowed. Like Georgia Lee's parents literally locked her in a room.
Right. Rather than admit that she was in love with another girl.
Right.
So That was handled just beautifully. And I think that one of the themes that you really bring out through the queer relationship, but through the entire book in the small town was, you talk about, you have this one great sentence. This was like one of my favorite. You wrote, there were rules for women and there were rules for men. Mm-hmm. And you talk about that a lot in the book. And I really want you to talk about it. In person, okay. Tell me.
Well, it's something I'm very familiar with. In my day job, I work in IT and I'm a project manager. I've almost exclusively worked with in male-focused fields, male-dominated. I'm usually the only woman at the table, so I know what that's like. And I think too, when you're a queer woman, especially if you're butch, which I'm not, but you just knowing butch women, there's this camaraderie that a lot of cishet white men kind of try to have you, where it's like they bro it up, and it's almost like this outsider view that your position that you're in, to kind of see, oh, you can get away with so many things, but you're still a woman and you can't get away with it, and it's just living under patriarchy.
Yes, but you call it out. And I love that.
You have to. I call it out at work. I call it out, in my employment history, because it's important, and we have to lift others up behind us.
But there's something about, writing that sentence down, right? Like putting it in a book makes it real and makes it something that we get to talk about, right, tonight. Exactly. So another thing that I think you did so beautifully that you make us talk about a little bit towards the end, we have, a conversation with a police officer. And you wrote, you got called out to the house all the time and you didn't do a thing. She glared at him. I remember you smirking at Warren, that was her stepdad, abusive stepdad, joking about women, how they're sensitive, how sometimes things get out of hand, but it was no big deal, right? These things work their way out on their own in the home. And the officer says, I don't know what you're talking about. And then she says, after you left, Diane hit me, gave me a concussion. I didn't go to school for a week. So there we go. You also have rules that, right, the police officers following, like, women, whatever, it just work themselves out. But here you call that out and you do that so beautifully. Was that hard to put that on the page?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in parts of a domestic violence situation with my stepfather and in my mother's home. And so it was difficult because you don't really realize the impact that it has sometimes until you're older and you're away and you can kind of see it a little bit more objectively. But it's a reality for so many people, and it's a reality for friends I've had, family members I've had. And I don't know, maybe it's not talked about enough, but I definitely think it's something we shouldn't shy away from. And, not all things are rosy. And so it just kind of fit with this particular narrative.
But that attitude too of like, oh, the women will just work it out, right? This is just the way it goes. Right. And the police officer leaving, and then this child has a concussion for a week. Right. I was so glad to see you put it on the page, although it was very hard to read. Yeah. And you wrote about the abuse, the way it affected the children, the brother and sister, right? And how they were terrified every time his car pulled up. Right. What Warren were they going to see? Right. Right. And I just thought, like, how did you dig into yourself to write that? I had a hard time reading it. Yeah. How hard was that to write it?
I think it was hard in some ways, but not in another. Like it's that fear is a familiar feeling. And sometimes I think, when you grow up in that situation, it's almost comforting. There lots of studies in psychology about how the trauma response, sometimes you go toward the event that caused you trauma because there's comfort there, which is really weird. There's a great book, The Body Keeps the Score, that goes into this much better than I ever could. But yeah, it was really going into, I think, that trance-like state that happens when you're writing and you're just like, this is what is happening, and it comes out on the page. And sometimes I'm not even aware of it. Yeah. Like it's not planned out. It's just what happened because it's like I'm the director and the actors and the writer all at once when I'm putting it on the page.
Wow. That's really impressive. That's really amazing. It comes out that way. It was so visceral, and I could see, right? So so emotional. It was just beautifully done with the right touch. And then not far from that, you have the humor to lighten up the moment, right? And then we hear about Leslie Borden. Right. So it's like you take us down and then you bring us up. And it's like, okay, I can breathe and I can keep breathing now. Yeah. So I thought that was done beautifully.
And I think that's a very common thing for a lot of people. Dark humor really helps us get through tough times.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you had touched on it briefly, what I'm going to call is the Greek chorus.
Yes.
Right? So I thought this was beautiful. And also there was sort of this whole theme that I read into the book. Maybe it wasn't there. And you can tell me this like Odysseus, right? Like Jane sort of has this childhood and then she goes out and she lives most of her adult life somewhere else. And then she comes back, right? Like back to her home to see what's there. And you have a Greek chorus.
I know.
Can you talk about your Greek chorus?
Sure. You make me sound more intelligent than I am because I definitely never even thought of that. So I love it.
True.
I'm going to use it all the time. It's like Odysseus. So I do love the Greek chorus. I've read it. I think the first time I really understood what I was reading when I read something like that was Serena by Ron Rash. Mm-hmm. And he had all these workers in this lumber mill.
I haven't thought about the book in years.
And so I was like, wow, that's really great because you've got these two characters who are so close and so focused and kind of not in a narcissistic way, but they're so focused internally that it was really fun to be able to pull away the camera in a way and show what the town was thinking through the voices of these two auto body guys who they just, whenever I wrote that, I definitely was channeling my dad, who is basically all caps all the time and exclamation points. And it's just like the most ridiculous thing you could possibly think or say. I'm like, let's talk about Maud.
Okay, I just want to say that Kelly's deadpan delivery of that, my dad is all caps all the time. That's the way your books read, right? Like you stop and you're like, wait, that was funny. That was funny. So your dad is all caps all the time and he was channeling this chorus.
Yeah. So I was channeling him and kind of his voice. I was like, well, it would be like if my dad and his best friend from his factory job, Sunshine, just got together and they were like, let's talk about work. And then so they just pick all these different topics around town to kind of explore, really just talk about, gossip about.
Yeah.
And it's just fun.
Yeah.
And it gives you a different angle and lets other people in the town kind of have a voice.
Yeah. I love it. I just thought it was great and it added so much to it. So one of the other themes that I really loved in this book, real bad things. Kelly knows I love to show the cover to remind everybody, this is the book we're talking about. But what I really wanted to ask you about too is this question of what is family and what are you returning to? Because Jane lived most of her life outside of the Bottoms, right? Like she wasn't there. And yet that is where her soul was in so many ways. So like, how did you come to that and how did you think about that as you were writing?
I think with family, especially with queer communities, family is found family and it's chosen family. And that's certainly the case for Jane. But even though she's been away, she still doesn't quite have that. It's almost like she's stunted in some ways because she had to leave and she doesn't have any resolution with this horrible thing that happened. And so for her, her family is her brother. It's her best friend, Georgia Lee Lane, and her best friend, Angie Pham. And together they were just a core group that helped her and Jason to kind of survive their childhood the best they could. But even with that, you know, there's this bond with blood family that you can't ignore. It's like as much as you're like, that person is not great for me. They're a toxic mother. However, they're still my mother. And especially when you see other people, you know, Jane sees other people having healthy relationships with their family. There's a contrast that you cannot ignore.
Yeah. I mean, I have to be honest, her brother as a character, I'm just going to say in the first 3/4 of the book, right? I felt so torn about him. Because on the one hand, I was like, I love him. I feel bad for him. She's, you know, Jane is the protector. But then I was like, oh, I hate him. Like, I want him to stand up for her more, like do more. So I don't know. Did you have a love-hate with him too?
I didn't because also I know all the the background.
Right.
I know the
No spoilers.
No spoilers. I know inner workings. So he had his own stuff going on, and I think too, you find that with people again in trauma where the response is very different, and some people who can be very strong and bold, whereas other people they just can't. They're kind of again stunted and they can't move past what's happened, and express themselves emotionally the same way other people can.
Yeah, I guess that's what it was, that he was stunted, and I wanted him to just like run over and hug her and kiss her, right? And thank her. But he just didn't have that. He was so reserved, and but then I just felt bad for him. So it was tough. It was a well-written character. I feel like any character you can love to hate, right? And love hate.
Right.
Good job.
Thank you.
It's hard to write. Yeah. Okay, so I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about writing this book. Okay. So can you talk about the process, right? There was sort of a gap between, so I know Kelly through Grub Street, of course, and so I've been through the entire process of this book and books coming, and there's a bigger gap between Cottonmouth and Real Bad Things than there's between Real Bad Things and the next book that is also coming. So can you just talk about that process and going, right, how you had more time and less time? What's going on?
Yeah, so Real Bad Things really came about from two different manuscripts that I had written, and that both of the manuscripts were much darker, and a lot of my stuff is dark, but I can't really go out into the world with that. I have to kind of pull it back and find a plot. So just deliver fun. So my agent at the time and I had sent both manuscripts to her, and it just wasn't quite working. And then so I took the pieces that I really loved from the one manuscript, and I took a character I loved from the other, and I kind of thought about how they might work together. So for me, I always start from character, and I kind of see my characters as avatars in some way. It's like you spend all this time creating them, so you can put them in any other situation and kind of see how they might react with these other characters. And so that's what I did. And I just found that there was some magic between Jane and Georgia Lee. So once I had that, then it turned into getting the idea of the lock and dam and the drowning. And so building in some of the pieces that were just more fun and interesting. And again, I had to add plot. Plot is always the hardest for me.
Really? Because you have so much plot in here.
I know.
I never would have guessed that. So how do you come up with plot if it's so hard for you?
It takes a lot of time. It doesn't take as much time now.
Okay.
I've gotten better at it because I read a lot of books. So if there's something that I want to, a storyline that I want to emulate in some way, I go to my bookshelf and I find books that might be the same. I find comparable books, and then I'll read it like a writer and kind of mark the places of when things happen and when point of view shifts happen, so I can see kind of the flow. And then I try to go back, kind of like training wheels in some way, or scaffolding.
Okay.
So not the exact book, but just the structure and the pacing and tension shifts, that sort of thing. And it just helps me to figure it out. And then I also rely on a lot of my friends. One of my close friends, PJ Vernon, he wrote Bathhouse, and
Great book. Check it out.
And so he's really excellent with plot. So he'll let me know when I go a little too long on character and internal monologue, and be like, let's think about something else we can do here.
I love that you're talking about this, because I think some readers who are not involved in the process of writing think that these, books are just born, right? As these things. But actually, right, you're talking about this whole process of you have other readers, you have authors reading, right? And who just come out and tell you, like, not working, right?
And it's so important. And I think that's the main thing that I think aspiring writers should know is that it is a team sport. It can be a team sport, even if it's just your community. Like we have shared some reading, but for the most part, we share the writing journey together, the publication journey, and that's just as important. I would say even more important than sharing each other's work. But I think you need both. You need people who can read. You need people who you can just talk to about the writing process and the journey, because it is a long one. It can be a long one. It's a tough one. It's a rewarding one. But I think so many of the rewards are the people. It sounds like a cheesy commercial. The people we've met along the way. But it's true, because I've met people like Rachel and now all of you.
Yes, but it is a very long slog. But what's been fascinating to me is that with your new publisher now, you have some serious deadlines.
Oh, yes.
And not all publishers have serious deadlines. So what's it like to write under a serious deadline?
Oh, God, it sucks.
When I just yes, it does. I mean, to be clear, like, there are many publishers that you could call up and be like, could they have another month, another 6 months? And most of them will say, sure, take your time, don't worry about it. But not Kelly's.
No, if Jessica's watching, I want her to know. I definitely.
But in the best possible way. I mean, it's amazing, right?
I was able to get an extension.
Yes, it's an incredible book, but you have had hard deadlines. So can you talk about being under those deadlines?
I mean, it's hard. It's easier probably for me because I'm a project manager in my day job. So I know about goals and priorities and time management probably more than most. But even then, it's really tough because I already had a book in mind. So I was already halfway there. But so much of the writing process is thinking. I spend tons of time thinking and letting ideas simmer and letting characters. Yeah, just letting the characters kind of play and do their thing in my head before I even sit down to write. But when you're on a hard deadline like that, it's really hard to get that time for thinking in there. That said, I really loved also, it was very hard emotionally, mentally, physically. But that said, I do appreciate a deadline, of course. And I had mentioned to all of you, I'm turning in my edits today. They're due at midnight West Coast time, developmental edits for the third book. But I really love this next book. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is the best thing I've written. So,
I can't wait.
It feels worth it. TBD if it is.
Oh, I'm sure it is. So I can't wait. Okay, so I want to ask you, my last question is the one that I ask every author who comes on my show, because my listeners, the people who are watching, always want to know, what advice do you have for new writers or aspiring writers? And I know you gave some little tidbits, but do you have anything else that you'd like to really put out there for all of us to know?
Yes, the thing I always say is tenacity really wins out over anything else. And there are always rules about you should write every day or you should do this, and I'm really not. Even though I'm a project manager, I'm not truly a rule follower. I believe in following the rules that work for you. I can't write every day. It's just not possible. And my brain just doesn't work like that. I think about my books every day, the work in progress. But the only reason I got published because I was tenacious enough to keep it going. And a lot of people don't. And I was around a community again who they would be around me and support me and ask me, like you do all the time, what's going on with your book? And we say this to our friends as well. We're like, have you queried yet? What are you doing over there?
Well, I mean, it's a really important part of the process, right?
Exactly.
Because you don't want to answer again like nothing.
It's a little peer pressure. Gentle. Gentle nudges.
Gentle. They're great. So can you just give us an example of ways in which you were tenacious, or what this tenacity that you're talking about? Like, can you be a little specific?
Yeah. So in Cottonmouth, that's the best example.
Your first novel.
Right.
If you haven't read it, check it out or buy a copy.
It took me basically from start to finish, all told, about 20 years. And there were years in there when I did not write at all, and I gave up on it. And I tried it as a screenplay. I tried it as this, as that. And the final book is about 5% of the first draft. Oof. And you really have that tenacity is going back to that draft draft over and over. I don't know how many draft number, whatever, like
Yeah.
who knows? So I try not to keep count because it's depressing, but
Yeah.
Just to know that you're going and keep going and
Yeah.
eventually
Keep
you'll
going.
get there.
And then you end up with a beautiful book, like
Yes.
Real Bad Things. Kelly Ford, thank you so much for
Oh,
joining me here today. It's been absolutely a thrill to have you. I love the book. For people watching today, for people in the room, if you haven't already, go out there and get a copy. You can get it at the Howe Library here in Hanover, New Hampshire, or at your local library, or you can go to your local bookstore like Still North, who's here tonight selling copies. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the Howe Library Corporation. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you to our amazing producers, Megan Coleman and Jared Dennis, who are here tonight, and Still North Books for being here to sell books. Thank you to all of our listeners and audience.